Hey guys, welcome back to our second part of solving quadratic equations. And before we get into our next thing, we need to have a little mini lesson to just catch us up to speed if we're not comfortable with it already. And so the first thing we have to remember is we have to remember our perfect squares. And the perfect squares are the things on the right. So we need to know that 1 squared is 1, and 2 squared is 4, and 3 squared is 9. Essentially, we need to know the square roots of these. So if we took the square root of 81, we need to know that that is 9. Um, and so, right, so the square root of 81 is 9. So that's going the other way. The square root is saying what squared is 81, and the answer is 9. Um, and so here's a couple rules on 2 squares. So if you have the square root of x times y, that's the same thing as the square root of x times the square root of y. And this helps us simplify. So delta math is going to want things in simplified form. So if we had something like the square root of 18, that's the same thing as the square root of 9 times 2, right? Because 9 times 2 is 18. And then we can split that out to the square root of 9 times the square root of 2, because that's what this says, right? You can split it up. And then the square root of 9 we know is 3, and then we have 3 times the square root of 2, so this would be the simplified form. And so we're going to go over a few examples of that. If I think I accidentally, there we go. Oh, why is it freaking out? Let's go to the top. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we have the square root of 72, and what I like to think of is I like to go back to this list, and I like to start under 72, so 64. Is 64 a multiple of 72? No. Is 49? No. Is 36? Yes, right? So this is the same thing as the square root of 36 times 2, which is the same thing as the square root of 36 times the square root of 2. Square root of 36 is 6, and then we still have that times square root of 2. So this is simplified. Now, same thing here. The square root of 6 doesn't simplify any further, but we have 3 times 7, right? And technically, even though it's not written there, we have a times the square root of 6. So we can times that 3 and 7 to make it nice. So 3 times 7 is going to be 21, and then we still have that square root of 6. So now we have, I'm going to rewrite this as 5 times 8 times the square root of 200. And I'm just going to zoom in on the square root of 200 for a second. Now that one, I recognize as the square root of 200 is nice. It's 100 times 2. And we know we can split it up to the square root of 100 times the square root of 2. So we really have the square root of 100 is 10 times the square root of 2. So I just said that the square root of 200 equals 10 square roots of 2. So let me replace that here. 5 times 8 times the square root of 200 is the same thing as 10 times the square root of 2. And now we can just do 5 times 8 times 10, which is 400, and then we solve that square root of 2 out there. So 400 square root of 2. Now this one, again, we can multiply in any order, and we actually have multiplication in here. So I'm going to do 2 times 9, and then times the square root of 6 times the square root of 18, right? And so here I can do the 2 times 9, which is 18. And then I think it's easier to combine these first. So we have 6 times 18 in here. And we can make that 18. The square root of 6 times 18 is 108. And now I'm just going to see what factors go into 108. And I think, 64 is not there. 49, I don't think is one of them. We try 16, no. Can we try 9? Yeah, so 9 works. What did we miss? We missed 36. Let me try 36. So 36 works, right? So 18 times 36 times 3, which is the same thing as 18 times the square root of 36 times the square root of 3. We know that the square root of 36, so we have 18 times the square root of 36 is 6, and times the square root of 3. And so then that simplifies. 18 times 6 is 108, and then we have square root of 3. And so now we have the square root of 72 all over 8. We did the square root of 72 earlier, right? The square root of 72 is the square root of 36 times 2, which is the square root of 36 times the square root of 2, which equals 6 square roots of 2 over 8. And then we can simplify 6 and 8, right? We can divide both of those by 2. So that'll be 3 square root of 2 all over 4. And that would be our simplest radical form. So that's just a preview so that we know how to simplify radicals super quick, because that's what Delta Math is going to want for these. So whenever we take the square root of a variable, we have to add plus or minus. So if we were to solve x squared equals 16, I could say let's take the square root of both sides. And as soon as I do that, I have to say plus or minus, right? So x equals plus or minus square root of 16 is 4. And why do we have to do that exactly? Well, let's think about it like this. If x was negative 4, then wouldn't negative 4 squared equal positive 16, right? So that's an answer. But 4 squared is also 16, right? So we have two answers. So that's why we need that plus or minus. So that's another important thing. And so now we're going to solve by taking the square root. And essentially, I'm going to solve until I have whatever is squared by itself. So first things first, there's a million ways you could start this, but I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides. So then I'm going to have 5x squared minus 5. 8's go away, and those 8's also go away, so we have 0 there. I'm going to divide by 5. 5 divided by 5 is 1, times anything is just itself. 0 divided by 5 is just 0. Add the 5 over, and so we get x equals plus or minus, take the square root of both sides, plus or minus because we took the square root of 5. And that'll be our answer. Now for this one, I'm going to get rid of this 4 right away. 4 divided by 4 is 1. 1 times anything is just itself, x plus 6. The entirety thing squared. 4 divided by 4 is 1. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. I am going to square both sides. When I square, I'm going to add plus or minus to the other side. So now, the square of this whole thing squared is just going to be what's left over, equals the square root of 1 is just 1, but we have plus or minus 1. And so now we have to subtract that 6 over, right? But how is this going to look? Now we have x equals, and then when I have plus or minus, I like to write minus 6 plus or minus 1. But we can actually calculate that, so let's do that. So we have, one of the options is negative 6 plus 1, and then our other option is negative 6 minus 1. And that first one, negative 6 plus 1, is going to get us negative 5. And that bottom one, negative 6 minus 1, is going to get us negative 7. So we have two answers for this one. And again, on Delta Math, when you have two answers, hit that comma, and it'll split it up and you'll be able to put in two answers, or there's a little plus sign on the right. So same idea here. I'm going to add that 7 over because I want whatever is squared by itself. So I'm going to get x plus 1 squared equals 30. Then I'm going to square both sides, and that square root and square are going to cancel out. We're going to be left with x plus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of 30, right? And now I'm asking, does the square root of 30 simplify? I don't think it does, right? 30 splits up into 5 and 6, 3, 2. Yep, nope. 30 does not split up nicely. So now I just subtract this 1 over, and now I have negative 1 plus or minus the square root of 30 are my answers. Well, now it's a little different. Now I would just write my two different answers. Delta math might let you do the plus or minus, but to be safe, you could do negative 1 plus the square root of 30. That's one answer. And negative 1 minus the square root of 30 would be our two answers. And then you may or may not have seen the quadratic formula before. So if we have something equal to 0, like we've liked to do lately, right? We like to have things equal to 0. Then we can use this formula, which I would write down. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a are the solutions, right? So factoring is a really nice way because I think it's faster if you can factor. Or taking that square root is a nice way if the problem allows you to take a square root that easily. But if you're up against something and you're like, man, I'm not sure what to do, or if you have a quadratic, so this ax squared plus bx plus c, and you need this equal 0, you need that equal 0, then, and you really just can't remember what to do, this will get you there every time if you calculate it correctly. So let's remember our quadratic formula. It's negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And this is a, this is b, and this is c, right? And sometimes I might like to write it off to the side just to help me out. A is 20, b is 11, and c is negative 3. All right, c is negative 3. And it wants it in simplest radical form. So let's just do this. Negative b is going to be negative 11 plus or minus the square root of b squared is 11 squared minus 4 times a, which is 20, times c, which is negative 3, all over 2 times 20. And so we just have to be careful now, right? So now we're going to have negative 11 plus or minus, and then this I'm going to use my calculator. We know 11 squared is 121. And then notice we have 4 times 20 times negative 3 minus, we're going to end up being minus a negative, but we're adding. So we get the square root of 361 under all that. All over 2 times 20 is 40. And now from here, our answer is a little weird, right? So the square root of 361 is actually 19. So I just typed in, and you're not supposed to know that, but I just typed it into my calculator, square root of 361, and it turns out it's a nice I squared, so that's 19. And so what we really have is negative 11 plus or minus 19 all over 40. Well, now let's do this. So we have two options. We have, I'm going to work upwards a little bit. So we have negative 11 plus 19 all over 40. And we have negative 11, I'll write the other one over here, negative 11 minus 19 all over 40. And plus 19, we're going to get positive 8 over 40. Both divide by 8 to be 1/5. And this one, we're going to get negative 30, right? Why is my brain like stopping? Yeah, negative 30 over 40. So this will be negative 30 over 40, which will simplify to negative 3/4. So our two answers are 1/5 and negative 3/4. That's an x equals two answers, right? And now here, I think this one might be a little simpler. We have an invisible 1 in front of that p, so a equals 1, b equals 2, or actually, so I almost missed something here, right? An important note is we need equal to 0, so I'm going to add that 5 over first. So I'm actually going to have p squared plus 2p minus 8 equals 0. And so that changes my a equals 1, b equals 2, and now my c is changed to negative 8. And now I just plug it in, right? We have negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared. 2 squared is 4, minus 4 times a, which is 1, times c, which is negative 8, all over 2 times a, which is just 1. And so now, it's just a matter of calculating this out. We have negative 2 plus or minus the square root of, this will be minus a negative, right? Because we have negative 8, so minus a negative, so it'll actually be positive. So 4 plus 4 times 8 is 32, so we'll actually have the square root of 36. That's kind of nice. All over 2 times 1 is just 2. And we know that negative 2 plus or minus square root of 36 is just 6 all over 2. And so now I'm going to go over here and work these both out. We have negative 2 plus 6 all over 2. That's going to be 4 over 2, which is just 2. And then our other one is negative 2 minus 6 all over 2. So that's going to be negative 8 over 2 or negative 4. So our two answers would be x equals negative 4 and 2. And that one is really just plug and chug. So you might want to work on that. So use the quadratic formula to solve for x. Leave in simplest radical form again. Just one last one. We have to subtract that 2d squared over, so we get 0. 5d squared minus 2d squared is going to be 3d squared plus 5d minus 3 equals 0. I have a feeling this one's not going to turn out so nice, so we have a equals 3, b equals 5, c equals negative 3. And then we just follow our formula. We do negative b, so I'm not going to worry about this here. So we're going to do negative b, so negative 5 plus or minus the square roots of b squared. 5 squared is 25 minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a, 2 times 3 is 6. And so now we have 4 times 3 times 3 is 36. It's going to be negative 36. And we're going to add 25 to that. So we are going to get, I'm going to continue down here. We have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 25. This is going to be negative 36, right? So minus and negative is actually going to be plus 36 all over 6. And so then we have negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 61 all over 6. And now 61 is one of those things where I don't think anything really nice goes into it. Yeah, nope. So 61 is just as it is. And I think this is how you can put it into Delta Math. I think they let you do a plus or minus. If they don't, you would just write x equals negative 5 plus square root of 61 all over 6. And your other answer is x equals negative 5 minus the square root of 61 all over 6. And that is going to wrap it up for solving quadratics.